What if I told you that Africa's poverty isn't about geography or natural resources, but something far more hidden, powerful, and human? Today, we're diving into a groundbreaking insight from a study rooted in the work of daron acemoglu and James A. Robinson at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Beyond that asks, why is Africa still so poor despite its vast resources? We'll walk through their argument, how institutions shape outcomes, how history left a mark, and why the answer is far less obvious than bad luck or poor leadership. By the end, you'll see why simply sending more aid isn't enough and what may really need to change. Let's start with the big picture. The authors ask why some nations are rich and others remain trapped in poverty. They examine Africa as a major case, a continent with immense land, natural resources, youthful populations, and yet chronic poverty in many countries. One of their central claims: it's the kind of institutions, political and economic, that determine whether a country can prosper. They distinguish between inclusive institutions, which allow broad participation, protect property and innovation, and create incentives for investment, and extractive institutions, which concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a few, restrict opportunity, and stifle innovation. In Africa's case, many states inherited or developed extractive institutions, whether from colonial rule or internal power structures that limit broad-based growth. Another key element: the historical roots. In much of Africa, colonial powers set up systems designed to extract resources and labor, that is, extractive institutions, from the get-go. The idea is that these institutions didn't simply vanish after independence. They left legacies of weak rule of law, elite capture, and limited investment in broad public infrastructure. So the study says, it's not that Africa lacked resources or that Africans lacked talent. It's that the rule book of institutions has been stacked against broad growth. These authors don't deny geography or culture matter, but they argue those factors are not enough to explain why some places succeed and others don't. For example, two countries might share similar climate, or neighbouring regions might share ethnicity, yet diverge massively in prosperity. The difference? Institutions. Similarly, foreign aid or external investment by itself cannot compensate for dysfunctional institutions. The incentives still go wrong when local elites benefit rather than society at large. One of their warnings: extractive institutions create a vicious cycle. Once elites hold power and can block innovation, they resist reform. Investment stays low, entrepreneurship suffers, and poverty becomes entrenched. Breaking that cycle is extremely difficult. In Africa, this means many countries are curbed not by a single event, but by long-term institutional traps. Weak checks on power, limited property rights, corruption, lack of broad education and infrastructure, and so on. The study also shows that change is possible. There are African countries which are improving institutional frameworks, some with increasing democracy, improved rule of law, and investment in human capital. These examples underscore that the institutional path is not predetermined, but progress is slow and uneven. Here's the problem. For many in Africa, the standard narratives don't hit the mark. We often hear that poverty in Africa stems from bad geography, tropical diseases, corruption culture, or lack of resources. But this research suggests many of these explanations are insufficient because they don't address the institutional root. The challenge then becomes, if institutions are the core issue, how do you reform them, especially when the people who benefit from the status quo have power? And for billions living in poverty right now, waiting decades for deep institutional reform isn't a viable comfort. Many African countries are resource-rich, but the study argues that resources can become a blessing and curse when combined with extractive institutions. Governments focus on controlling resource rents rather than building broad-based economies. Elites capture the wealth, and the majority don't benefit. This is sometimes called the resource curse. If institutions were inclusive, resource wealth could be marshaled into infrastructure, education, innovation, and generate long-term growth. But when extractive patterns dominate, the opposite occurs. The paper draws attention to the empirical finding that many of the places that were relatively rich at the time of European colonization ended up poorer today than those that were poor then. That reversal of fortune is explained by the types of institutions introduced. Nobelprize.org. Many African countries inherited systems built for extraction, with weak incentives for broad inclusion. Political economic checks. Point 3. In many cases, political power is concentrated. The institutional environment does not allow citizens to hold leaders accountable. There is weak rule of law. Property rights may be insecure. All of these discourage investment and innovation. The study argues that without inclusive political institutions, not just economic ones, inclusive growth is not possible. In Africa, this means even when economic reforms are attempted, they may get captured by elites or fail due to weak institutions. Because if you just send money or aid, the institutional framework still determines who captures that money and whether it leads to broad growth. The study suggests that without institutional reform, aid can even reinforce extractive dynamics. University of Oxford. Thus, policy implications become difficult. Reforming institutions is politically perilous and long-term. While the study provides a somewhat sobering diagnosis, it also points to what might help. Building inclusive political institutions, broad enfranchisement, checks on power, accountability, protecting property and contract rights, investing in human capital and infrastructure, and creating economic institutions, markets, rule of law, that reward broad participation. In Africa, we see some countries moving in this direction. For example, improvements in governance, anti-corruption efforts, regional integration. But the pace remains slow and uneven. Here's the key moment you want viewers to grasp. The reason many African countries remain poor is not because they lacked resources or hard work, but because their institutional architecture blocked growth for decades, even centuries. And the very same institutions, if reformed, could unlock dramatic growth. But that requires political will, courage, and societal change. Think of it like this. Two countries, similar in many surface ways, walk different institutional paths. One invests broadly, includes many voices, protects rights. The other concentrates power, squeezes many for the benefit of few. Over time, the difference compounds into vast divergence in prosperity. In Africa's case, the institutional tape has been rolling in the extractive direction, too often reinforcing elite capture and stifling innovation. That is the moment where the theory meets the lived reality, and the future hinges on whether those institutions can shift. Vast natural resources, youthful populations, and favorable geography are not sufficient for prosperity. The real driver of long-term growth is institutions, both political and economic. Inclusive institutions lead to sustainable growth. Extractive ones lead to stagnation and poverty. In Africa, historic legacies of colonialism, resource extraction, and elite rule have produced institutional architectures that trap many countries in poverty. External aid and superficial policy fixes can't substitute for deep institutional reform. The process is slow, often contested, and requires broad participation and political transformation. On the positive side, institutional change is possible. The few countries in Africa that have made progress show that this path, though difficult, is not closed. Ultimately, the message is one of both realism and hope. Realism about the institutional challenges. Hope because change is not impossible. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe and check out the channel to find more amazing and new videos.